What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Archill Podcast. Today I have a very special guest, John Crickett. John has been in software engineering for about 30 years now. His experience includes different seniority levels, from engineering management to software architecture. He's the founder of the popular Coding Challenges newsletter, which boasts over 70,000 subscribers. Each week, John offers practical coding challenges to help software engineers enhance their skills through building real-world applications. He's also known for being active on LinkedIn, sharing his enormous experience with the community. I'm super excited to share this episode with you. So here it is, my conversation with John Crickett. Enjoy. So you've been in software engineering for about 30 years, am I right?
Nearly, yeah. Thanks for
Yeah,
reminding me how
that's
old I am.
yeah. So that's amazing, first of all. And what was your first programming language? Let me start easily.
My first programming language was BASIC on a ZX Spectrum in 1985, I think. So
Whoa.
going back quite a long time ago. I was probably about 7 or 8 at the time.
Whoa.
Good fun,
So
but very
yeah.
very different to modern software development.
Yeah, and that's what I'm kind of aiming to figure out right now, talking in this first part of our conversation. So, how was the programming different back then? How were the computers, the machines, and how was it? I mean, obviously, it's super different from today's approaches we do, right? But how was it? Can you tell us back then?
Well, all the way back then it was very different because, like I say, I was 7 or 8 years old. Back then you loaded up software and you saved the software you wrote to an audio tape, so a cassette tape, if you still remember those.
Yeah.
And if you haven't seen it before, you should really suffer the horribleness that is listening to a software load on something like Spectrum and see the squiggly coloured lines you get on the screen and the horrible high-pitched sounds that you get. And it was very like that. It took minutes, and if your tape machine ate the tape, you lost your software and all sorts of fun things like that. It was very, very different back then. And then when I ended up at school and having access to slightly more modern computers that actually had 5 1/4 inch floppy disk drives, that was heaven. No noise. You just put the disk in, and they were so much more robust. But even then, my first software away from the ZX Spectrum was on a BBC, also in BASIC. So it's very different and writing much smaller programs, much simpler software.
Yeah. And what about like maybe let's move a little bit like later, maybe in 2000s or like 90s, later 90s. I mean, back then, I mean, now we have Google, right? And we can Google stuff, we can figure things out super easily. But how was it then? So whenever you face some issue, were you digging in some books or asking some other people, or how were you basically figuring things out which you didn't know?
So a little bit later than what we just talked about, but back when I first started really learning to code, you got a magazine or a book that maybe came once a month, and that had program listings in it, and you'd patiently type them out, correct any errors you made, then try and figure out what the error was that, even though you typed it perfectly, it was a bug in the program that they put in the magazine. And when you got stuck, you had a manual that came with your computer. You opened it and it had the reference to the BASIC or whatever language your computer came with at the time in the back. You looked things up in there, you figured it out. If there were errors in there, it was kind of tough, or you asked a friend.
Yeah.
So it was very, very much a case of trial and error. There were times when, as I got a little bit older and had a bit more freedom and the ability to move, you'd go to a library and get a book out and refer to the book for things and pore over it. And it was just a lot of debugging and trial and error.
Yeah, good. So also, like, can you walk me through, like, you have seen a lot, obviously. I mean, you have seen like maybe probably from this kind of tape tapes which you mentioned till today, right? This crazy AI cloud stuff going on out there. So can you just walk me through some kind of uh, checkpoints or some kind of steps which happened during these many years while you're in industry? I mean, what were like some dramatic kind of changes or some kind of evolution of industry from your point of view?
So the most dramatic thing that really happened is probably in the mid to late 90s, started getting far more interest in home computers and personal computers. There became far more books available. There started to be the proliferation of books on doing more interesting things like games programming, and demo programming used to be quite a big scene as well. So there were more books available. There started to be things like C compilers available to those of us that weren't paying thousands of pounds for commercial products. There was a shareware scene, and what eventually became the open source scene started to kind of appear. Linux itself appeared. I remember hearing about Linux version 1, and back in those days, it took a very hardcore computer nerd to really install Linux. It was something that you did, and you spent days or weeks figuring out how to do and getting drivers. And that really took off with the internet, which again started kicking off for most of us in the mid to late 90s. And that revolutionized things. We had access to a lot of information. There were, back in those days, we used things like IRC and news groups to chat. Things that still exist, but are kind of forgotten about in the background now. And those were great. The news groups were a fantastic resource. They're like early forums, but use the news group formula to access information and share that with other people and collaborate, just like you do in a modern forum or social media. And then you started to be able to access information from around the world, get hold of more tools. The tools evolved a lot. We started to move away from DOS and command line programming to actually having GUI programming. And I remember the first time I saw Bull and Delphi. This was amazing. You could actually build a GUI nice and simply without having to very complex code, and you could actually drag stuff around and get what you want. And then as the internet evolved and started to take off, there was a lot of excitement around all the dot-com startups in the 2000s, but it also meant that information started to become a lot easier to get hold of. Both books, for a start. To then, if you wanted a book about programming, you had to go to your library and hope that they had it, which most didn't, because it's still a bit of a niche subject. But then with the internet, things started to become available online. And then when Amazon opened up over here in the UK, that was just revolutionary for me. That's really what turned around my career, because I'd started working about the time when Amazon opened up here. I'd joined a thing called the ACCU, which at the time was the Association of C and C++ Users, and there were a lot of good book reviews there and people recommending books. So yeah, new to career, still living at home at the time, high disposable income relatively. Amazon was a godsend. I just bought dozens of books and learned so much from reading them. And that was great. The kind of curious thing at the start of the internet, though, was a lot of companies started to adopt that. So things like Microsoft, I was doing a lot of Visual C++ work at the time, and the Windows API. Their documentation was becoming quite big, so they started, instead of shipping on CDs, it was quite expensive, they started putting it online. But back then, the internet was kind of viewed by a lot of workplaces the way they view work from home these days, that the internet was a distraction and you were just going to be messing about all day and not doing any real work. So in a lot of companies, the internet was blocked. So I remember at times being, I'm writing C++, I need to refer to the Windows API docs. We won't buy MSDN, which came on like a dozen CDs and was several hundred or several £1,000s. I can get it on the internet now. I have to go and apply for special permission to access the internet because I might be doing something non-work all day on it. Yeah. So it's a weird time when you had to kind of beg and grovel and justify internet access as a developer. But all the documentation and references and useful materials and all the forums were online. So things then evolved quite a lot, and Google came out in I think 1998 and transformed search and made it far easier to find things. And then, as you've probably seen over the last 20 years, things have evolved massively since then. Nowadays, C++ is far less popular than it was back then. In the early 2000s, I couldn't move as a C++ developer for being offered jobs. Now, at least here in the UK, outside of London and certain tech industries, it's far less common. There's far more demand for JavaScript and Python. So many more people now are building web systems and focused on web development. And now, can't imagine working without internet access.
Yeah.
You just wouldn't get very far because you'll need to install a library, or you need to download a package, or you'll need to develop a tool, or you'll be deploying to the cloud. So it's
Yeah.
a completely different world.
Yep. So thanks, first of all. And you mentioned C++ and how kind of popularity of C++ decreased over like past years, right? And that's kind of inevitable thing. Like technologies come and go, and some become more popular, some less popular. But now my question is about programming languages. I mean, I know like from your resume on LinkedIn that you have had, you have worked like on multiple programming languages. Like first now you mentioned like basic, then you mentioned C++, probably you have worked with some others as well. And now I want to ask you to tell me like, what's the importance of touching different programming languages, and how important is it, or is it even important, or can we stick to one of them, or how's your perspective on that?
So I guess I have some bias there in that I have touched very many of them, and I think that's been incredibly useful for me. I can't imagine just knowing one and just knowing the concepts. So with that bias and without being able to put myself in the shoes of just knowing one, I think it's been very useful because I've been exposed to different paradigms, different approaches. So some languages like Java are entirely you can't do a thing. C++ is a multi-paradigm. Other languages have got more emphasis on the functional element. And I think having that diversity of experience is quite useful. It gives you the perspective that most of these programming languages are general purpose. You can use anything for anything. There are advantages to some. So, I'm quite enjoying using Lisp over the last year. It's a great language. It's very good for performance. It has a lot of benefits to offer, but again, that experience of being around for a while. Also know that its tool chain is relatively immature. There are going to be complexities with dealing with it. But that experience in all those different languages means you can look at things like Lisp and pick it up perhaps a bit quicker than somebody that's only had experience in JavaScript. The flip side of that is there's a danger sometimes of looking at too many shiny things and getting distracted.
Yeah.
And only having a fairly shallow knowledge of all of them. So, and the other thing is, at one point I was quite a strong C++ developer. I did a lot of C++. It was, in a way, part of my identity that I was relatively strong C++. I haven't touched it since 2016 in earnest. And even then I was mostly working as a manager, so it was probably going back to 2012 since I did any hardcore C++. It's evolved a lot since then, and I've learned several other languages, most recently Go and Lisp, since then. So now if I look at some C++, it's, if you pardon the pun, I'm quite rusty.
Yeah.
So I think it's incredibly useful to have that diverse context and to have seen different languages and seen the good parts and the bad parts and have that perspective. I think there's a danger if you learn too many that you become a jack of all trades, master of none, which sometimes is useful. So a lot of what I've done in the last few years is diving into different projects and helping out and dealing with kind of broader concepts. So being able to jump in any code base and having that confidence just to come along, jump in a code base has been really useful. But there's quite a few, like, I wouldn't want to do any hardcore C++ now without spending some months trying to get back up to speed and be efficient.
Yeah. Okay, great. And now let me move forward to one of the most interesting topics I would love to discuss with you. It's about learning new stuff. So can you share, like, how do you learn new things? What is your approach? And then, like, slightly we will move forward to coding challenges as well and all those stuff. So can you share that with me first? Yeah.
Sure. So my approach to learning has very much evolved over the years, and I'm a great believer in learn by doing. So historically, back to the days I talked about when Amazon first appeared in the UK, I would buy half a dozen books on a subject, read the different books, and I'm an avid reader, so half a dozen books I might have skim read or read one or two of them well and skim read within 24 hours of receiving them. So and nowadays we had just enough books or just enough tutorial, just enough of the documentation to get started. And then I start trying to build something. So I try and figure out a scaled back version of what I want to learn. So if I'm learning how to deploy, say, a container to the cloud, I'll figure out what's the minimum bare image I can do that's just going to maybe have a web service on it that's going to give me hello world, maybe as a Flask app or something. And I'll build just enough of the CloudFormation or Terraform or whatever I want to do to really deploy that. And, so learn just enough from some reference source, a tutorial, a book, or documentation. Build something that's just enough to get that incremental step, and then figure out what the next step I need to do is. Work on it until I get stuck. When I get stuck, find a tutorial, find a book, find a blog post, something on Stack Overflow or something in the documentation that enables me to kind of make that next step, and just iterate from there.
Yeah. Amazing. And I want to kind of point out one of the most famous. So you're pretty active on LinkedIn, and I would love to point out. I would like to rephrase one of the most frequent posts you do there. It's like the best way to level up your skills is by building real world software, right? Something like that. You constantly remind me and everyone around us about that, and that's super amazing. And it's like a cold shower every day. I see it, and every week whenever you post it. So it's really super, super important to don't fall into trap of this theory, books, tutorials. Obviously, they are important at some point, but without doing and building, this learning action cannot be successful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can learn a lot from books, you can learn a lot from tutorials, but in the teaching circles, there's a pyramid they have where you learn a certain amount from reading about something, you learn a little bit more from hearing about it, you learn a little bit more from having a demonstration, and ultimately you learn most by doing. So you want to incorporate all those things in our learning. So start with a book or tutorial, watch somebody else do it, learn just enough to get started, then go and build and iterate on that. And it makes that knowledge stick in your head. It makes you have a better understanding of it. And of course, the ultimate part of that is then to teach other people, because you have to take that knowledge that you've learned, you have to understand it well enough to distill it and explain it to somebody else. So for me, the coding challenge is a great way for everyone else to learn, because they can go and do what I talk about and learn by doing. But I get the next level of learning in that I have to do it all and explain it to somebody else.
Yeah, that's super amazing. And let's get on to the coding challenges. And can you tell us what it is? Obviously, we have talked about the idea behind that now, but what it is, what people should expect when they get there, and can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So Coding Challenges is a newsletter I publish every Saturday morning UK time. And each week it has a challenge in it, which is, it's maybe misnamed coding challenges because they're not really coding challenges. They're real world projects that you can work through to build a real world piece of software. So that is a slightly scaled back version of a real world piece of software that I break it down as steps of what you need to be able to build it. So you've got an incremental process to work through. And some of the projects have been things like build a Memcache server, build a web server. And yes, they're scaled back. They're not, you're not going to build the whole of Apache. It's a massive project, but enough to understand, what is HTTP? How do you implement that on the server side? How do you handle multiple concurrent connections? How do you handle accessing the disk and streaming that stuff back? So it gets you digging down and understanding these different concepts. One of the fairly popular projects is Redis, which again, it gets you looking at, are you going to handle concurrent connections with threads or asynchronously? How do you implement a protocol that's working over TCP/IP? How do you handle messages that become partial or full message? How do you parse that protocol? How do you serialize and deserialize it? How do you store the data? How do you handle concurrency and keeping that data safe? And I'm expanding that more recently with how does Redis then persist that data to disk? So the Redis challenge, for example, takes you through building what was the original version of Redis. So it's on functional parity with the original version of Redis. Redis itself is way more complex these days. And again, it would take months and months to replicate the full functionality it has nowadays. But the initial version as it was shipped is basically feature parity. So all of these, they're broken down step by step of the different things you can do and how you can approach it, with links to relevant tutorials or relevant protocols so that you can understand them. And again, data structure and algorithms are incredibly useful to know if you're in software engineering. I don't like the kind of LeetCode approach. I think that you need to apply them in context. So again, I encourage people, learn data structure and algorithms. It's incredibly useful. But learn the algorithm and data structures to build a compression tool using Huffman encoding. Learn the data structures and algorithms that you need to implement a diff tool and implement diff. Take that one step further and learn the data structure and algorithms that implement Git. Put your diff solution into a Git client and build a working Git client. So it's that approach, and learn by doing. So I encourage people to learn all sorts of different things. And I tried to pick out a variety of different tools. So some of them are more front-end based, like building a client for Spotify using an API. Some of them are more focused on servers, so like Redis, building a web server, building a Memcache server, building a NAT server. Others have a bit more of a focus on understanding how parts of the internet work. So we build a DNS client so you can do DNS resolution and deal with a UDP protocol and understand how that works, and the compression and the building headers around that. And all of these, I think, help exposure to different approaches, different parts of technology, and broaden your understanding as a software engineer.
Yeah, amazing. And just to kind of wrap this up, to summarize a bit, and I'm telling it to 4 years before myself. I mean, when I was an intern and when I was starting coding, I had this burning question: how do I start? I mean, I could not come up with project ideas. I could not come up with requirements. It was a burning problem for me. And now I see a lot of beginners around me who sometimes I guide them. I provide some requirements, some projects. But now after I got after I know about coding challenges, I always kind of suggest everyone, people, this is a gold on the internet. You can check out codingchallenges.com or FYI, right?
.fyi.
Yeah, I will link it in the description, and you have these ready descriptions of projects, and you can directly start learning by doing so.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
amazing.
There's 40 odd projects there already. Like I say, a new one added every week, and I was the same. It came about, the project itself, because I was learning Rust earlier this year, and I looked for a few projects to do, and I've kind of mentioned this. Somebody mentioned a few projects I've done in the past, so like the Huffman encoding is one that I've done for most of the languages I've learned since 1996. I first did it to learn C. I mentioned this, and somebody kind of made the comment I should light them up. So that's kind of how I started the newsletter, of writing some of the challenges that I was using to learn Rust and sharing those. And I thought other people might enjoy it. I thought there might be 1,000 people that would subscribe to the newsletter by the end of this year, and it's past 30 odd thousand on Substack and 50,000 or so on LinkedIn, and proved hugely popular. So it's been great, and I've just carried on having a lot of fun doing it. I'm meeting lots of great people like yourself, and it's proving a lot of fun, and it's been really, really useful for a lot of people, and a lot of people are learning from it. You say they're learning how to break down projects, they're learning how to pick things up, and people are starting to share their solutions. I've got a GitHub repo as well with shared solutions, and I'm working on trying to give people feedback on that, because again, there's lots of things that with those shared solutions we can discuss it and point out some of the things that they may have missed and some things they could think about. So for example, the first challenge that is to recreate the Unix tool WC, and an awful lot of people solve that without thinking bigger picture. And a lot of these Unix tools can be used for data engineering and for processing large volumes of data. So for WC, most people open the file, read the whole thing in, and then process it, which is fine for a toy file, a little test file. But these tools were designed and intended and often used to parse hundreds of gigabytes. That fails on most computers. So that's an interesting bit of feedback that I quite often find myself giving to people that have built the WC tool is, now take it to the next level, figure out how you would handle the 100 gigabyte file coming in.
Yeah, amazing. And I would love to also notice, mention the thing you mentioned about LeetCode and data structure and algorithms. I mean, of course it's good, but it's way, way more fun to apply them in real world projects. I mean, build some Huffman coding, for example, what you said, or just use those algorithms and data structures in real world projects. And that's, I mean, amazing what you just said. So I just love
Yeah,
it.
and I got a lot more satisfaction out of seeing my diff implementation run and show me a diff between two source files than I ever have from anything like Hackerlang or LeetCode when you run and it says, yeah, your test passed. No,
Yeah.
that's not very exciting, but seeing a little diff come up that looked just like Git's diff is like, hey, yeah, I've built something there. It's useful. So for me, at
Yeah.
least, it's far more satisfying, and I think that's true
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
lot of people as well.
Yeah. That's definitely true for about 70,000 people, right? Out there. Yeah. Okay. Now let me. I want to use this chance to talk to you about some career tips in software engineering as well. And like, I also like. I'm not like that experienced yet, for sure. But in software engineering, like even when you have a bit more experience than others do, you can share some tips, right? But sometimes I get some questions on which I don't feel qualified enough to answer, to give answers. And like the first question is like people often ask me how to get started in software engineering, and people often suffer to land their first job or kind of learn something and verify that this is useful and demanded. And what would your tips be for early stage software engineers who try to get into the industry, land their first internship, job, or whatever?
So I think in many ways, actually, you're better positioned to answer that than me, because I got my first job in the industry in 1996. It's changed massively since then. When I applied for my first job, I went to a payphone and stuck
Yeah.
some coins in and phoned a company, and it was completely different. And when they said, "Have you got a CV?" I said, "No, I'm a student, but I can post you a letter." And I wrote a letter to them and posted it. It's a very different world now. So I'll turn it back to you. What do you do as somebody that's newer to the industry?
Yeah.
What's your approach to getting a job? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, usually I advise two things. Like the first thing is that to get working experience, but by working experience, I mean building a lot of side projects. For example, building a lot with coding challenges or some other projects as well. And just never stop building. I mean, build even after you land your first job, just keep building on your free time, of course, but keep building and show in your resume that you are like super passionate and super motivated and you're actually a builder, so you can make things. So that's one thing. And another thing is, which is way less fun in our career and our industry, is that you need to do this action of applying for jobs and searching for jobs, and it should be like very constant action. I mean, I probably have applied for like tens or even hundreds of job opportunities when I wanted to start some internship, and like I had like 5 or 6 interviews. That's it out of these many. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
like uh, it's not like one day you sit, apply for 10 jobs, and that's it. I mean, it can take months, really. And it's not fun, but I think like some consistency and discipline that you can allocate at least an hour a day to handle those application stuff, that's useful. And the other time, continue learning and building. So that's like the tips I usually give people to the people outside. And
Yeah,
also
I think
like, yeah, sorry.
so. No, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, and also like I love LinkedIn, and I really really encourage people to kind of very actively use it, because like uh, all of my jobs which I landed, except the internship which I applied myself, were done either by LinkedIn or by network of by some peer of mine, by some referral. And it's super important to be active and kind of have your own network or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. So I totally agree on the networking. So throughout my career, I've done a mixture of contracting, permanent employment, and running my own businesses. And a lot of my own businesses, the work that we got and the customers we got, we acquired through networking. So networking is kind of powerful. I've also had several of my contract roles and several of my permanent roles, again, come through networking. So the people that I've met over the years, the people I work with. So, it's a bit of a cliche, but a lot of roles are filled through networking.
Yeah, it works,
So
actually.
build your network, build relationships. And again, things like LinkedIn, now you can start publishing content and build a bigger network and gain followers and build a bit of a personal brand. And particularly when the market's hard at the moment, for a lot of people, having that differentiator, standing out, it's useful. People will think of you when they start looking. And also when recruiters start looking, LinkedIn feeds them the most active people. They feed them the people that LinkedIn associates with whatever skill set they're looking for. So be out there, use things like LinkedIn and build your personal brand. I think you made a great point about keep applying for things and keep practicing, applying for jobs, doing your resume, CV, whatever you call it, and interviewing are distinct skills. And we need to practice them. And the people I've seen struggle most getting roles in their careers have been the people that have been in a role for 5, 6, even 10, 15 years. And when something unfortunate happens, like they've been made redundant or the company's folded, they've struggled to then get another job because they haven't had that skill and they haven't had that repetition of interviewing. So, it's definitely a skill that you need to practice. It's something that you can work on and that you can get better with practice. So that's great advice. I think what you said is very good.
Yeah, and let me kind of restructure my conversation because you mentioned this personal brand, and let's directly let me ask you about that. Can you share why behind this all this activity you do? Like you're super active in social media with these coding challenges, with your super insightful posts. I mean, and thanks again for that. For those, they are super useful. And what's the idea behind that? Why are you doing it, first of all? And can you share also some tips for people like me who are trying to kind of build their personal brand as well?
So I first started thinking about building a personal brand online a couple of years ago when I was aware that I was going to need to start looking for a new job. My contract was coming to an end. And somehow or other, I stumbled across this video of this crazy CEO with a mohawk, and it was bright purple, who was making the point that LinkedIn was a great place to build a personal brand, and he'd built a business off that. And I thought, that's quite useful. I've experienced that networking works. I've seen it work with time and time again for my business and stuff, and for other roles I've acquired. So I thought I should try this. I posted a little bit for a few months on LinkedIn, built a bit of momentum and a few connections, and got up to 1,500 followers or something, and was building some relationships. And this was kind of in the middle of COVID. It worked. I landed another role, so went off to that. Then I kind of drifted away from doing it because mission accomplished. I got another role. I was focused on that. Fast forward to last year, I joined a company in May, and I joined them at times when things were great. The economy was very good. The market looked good. It seemed like a great role, and I thought I was going to be there for a while. Again, kind of drifted away from it. Everything changed in the preceding thing. We started getting a lot of layoffs last year, and by about July, it was on my radar. There's a good chance that this role was going to fall through, and there were going to be redundancies. And sure enough, in September, 15% of the workforce was laid off. So late July, August, I started being more active on LinkedIn and starting to think, again, personal life. My kids are growing up. I've got a bit more time to focus things. I started to think about how could I build a business again? How could I start doing that? But I didn't have a clear idea. So again, I thought I'd start being a bit more active on LinkedIn to find a role as of being made redundant and to try and sort of stimulate some ideas for business and try and figure out what business I might build so that I didn't face redundancy again in the future and be a bit more in control of my own destiny. So I did that for a bit, started another role, getting tailed off. But then February this year, I was starting to be a bit more active, talking to people. And then, as I say, I had this conversation around March and I decided to build coding challenges. And I was still kind of looking for, what could I do? What business idea might I get? Where could I go with business? Coding challenges started to take off, become popular. So I just kind of followed it with that. I enjoyed writing. I was growing a lot. I was gaining a lot from that. And it kind of evolved organically and has really taken off. And it's been a bit of a flywheel effect there, that coding challenges gives me something concrete to talk about. It creates a lot of interest. It creates me lots of opportunities to meet people and talk like we're doing now. So now I'm just enjoying the journey and seeing where it goes. It's useful. For the coding challenges, I've been asked to run a few courses and create a few courses, so I've done that, and I've made a bit of money from that, and maybe that kind of becomes the business idea I build and expand to something else, or maybe it's some other idea. We'll see what the future holds.
Yeah, great to be part of your journey as well, like following you and kind of getting inspired and learning a lot from you as well. And what part, I mean, you mentioned all these benefits, like kind of benefits which this active kind of personal branding gives, but is there a part of some kind of a happiness that when you share something and a lot of people give you feedback that, whoa, that's amazing, and they are kind of satisfied with what you are sharing? Is there some kind of personal happiness emotionally you get?
Mostly when I get somebody that comes back and makes a good criticism. So if everyone just puts a nice post, well, okay, it's a little bit nice. It's nice when somebody says something's good, but it's not that valuable, is it? Whereas when somebody comes back and says, I disagree, and here's a good reason why, and they either convince me or I get a chance to kind of engage in a constructive debate with them, and maybe I convince them that I'm right, then that's very satisfying, because out of that, I either learned why I was wrong and I learned something new and I've learned and got better, or I learn how better to put my case and my argument across to them and convince them. So again, I've got better and I've learned from it. Or we don't convince each other, but then maybe I've had a constructive discussion and maybe I meet somebody and there's a positive outcome. So those to me are the most enjoyable ones, where you get a constructive discussion and I learn something from it, or I teach somebody else something, or I learn how better to present the argument. Because I'm quite a strong believer in strong opinions, but weakly held. So I do tend to put things out there in a bit more of a strong opinion way, in an opinionated way. But I'm happy to change my mind when I'm presented with evidence that I'm wrong. Because that's the win. I learn.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. Like, and mostly when I also kind of get the chance, like, to get into a discussion with some people, maybe on LinkedIn posts, some in comment section. And when I disagree or somebody else disagrees with me, those discussions are the most enjoyable. I totally agree. Okay. So let me, now I want to ask a question, which I'm personally kind of not struggling with, but I'm kind of learning now this process. So the process of conducting interviews.
Mm-hmm.
So can you share maybe like how can we conduct an interview? I mean, there are a lot of million ways to do that, but what's your like approach? I mean, more like some technical, more, I don't know, building thing during the interview, or how do you kind of evaluate engineers when you need to kind of conduct an interview?
So that has evolved a lot over the years. And I've been just as guilty as everyone else of setting technical tests early in my career, and even including some of the flawed trick questions, if you will. Nowadays, I prefer not to do that. I lean more heavily towards some kind of competency-based interview. So I'm figuring out what I need the engineer to do in the role. So what are the competencies we need? And then how can I ask questions that allow them to demonstrate that competency? So if we want somebody that works in a team, get them to tell you about a time when they worked in a team or when they didn't. And then drill down into that, get some evidence, and get them to show you and talk to you about it. If you need a particular expertise in, say, data engineering, get them to talk about a problem they face in data engineering, how they solved it. If it's working with AWS and cloud infrastructure, what did you build with AWS? What was the cloud infrastructure? Did you do infrastructure as code? Did you use Terraform or CloudFormation? How did you use it? What are the challenges you faced? So in each of these things, we can dig into people's skill set, see how much genuine experience they've got, and whether they've just done a simple tutorial, or whether they've really understood what they're doing, but without having to go to things like LeetCode, because you can look an algorithm up, and most of the algorithms that we use already exist in the standard library. You're not going to write a better solution than the standard library typically. Whereas, those competency-based skills tell you if somebody's actually done the job, if they've built the skills to do it. And then particularly if we get into the softer skills, which we don't ask about enough because software development is a team sport. Very rarely do you get one genius that sits in a corner on their own and builds everything from scratch. It just doesn't happen in any significant size business. We all need to collaborate with other people. Even if it's just one genius software developer and a product owner, you've still got to have that communication, or even one genius software developer and the customer. You need to talk to them. What do you want the software to do? What matters to you? How do you get value from it? So I also like to dig into those soft skills and explore things like teamwork, explore things like how you handle vague requirements, and then competency based.
Yeah, great. And I also wanted to ask about the non-technical skills, which are important for engineers. You kind of mentioned the soft skills in general, but can you maybe be more specific? I mean, what do you think engineers should have to be a successful engineer, except some technical skills?
Well, obviously teamwork that we just talked about, and the ability to get in there. I also think it's absolutely crucial that you learn to speak to other people in the business. So, we all genuinely work for a business or an organization. And for most of us, that organization isn't a tech company. The tech is an enabler. It enables you to do something. So we need to be able to talk to everyone else in the business or the organization, and we need to talk in their language, which normally isn't technology. I spent most of the last 4 years doing data engineering and doing a lot of Python and AWS. No one else in the business really cared about that. They cared about meteorological data. They cared about weather forecasts. They cared about complying with government regulations. They care about meeting the budget. They care about headcount and whether we can fulfill our commitments that are required us by being a public sector organization. So you need to be able to talk to everyone else at that level, and you need to also appreciate that we can't expect everyone else in the business to learn about engineering and come talk to us about engineering things, because they've all got their own problems to deal with. They've got sales, or they've got marketing, or they've got HR and regulations to deal with. So we need to find a way of communicating to them about what matters to them, what's the impact of what we're doing, how is it going to impact on them, what's important to them, and then what do we need from them for their support to be able to create that impact and the value that they need. So have those skills to be able to talk to other people, have that empathy to be able to go and understand what they need, and that attitude of teamwork to view that we're all one team, we're all trying to deliver some outcome for the organization that matters.
Yeah, thanks for that. And let's kind of slowly move to the end of our conversation. And let me ask a question which I'm personally super curious about too. So we have this all kind of crazy names for these engineering levels, right? It's slightly easier from junior, middle engineer to senior, and then it gets crazy. So staff engineer, principal, whatever they are calling it. But without all these names of these levels, can you indicate what are the factors which kind of identify more grown up engineer, let's say junior from senior, and how does it evolve? But let's don't call it such names like senior, or let's say a beginner, some kind of middle experienced guy, super experienced, super experienced. How does it go in this curve? What skills are needed? What are the factors?
So I think the simple way I always think about it and explain it to people is that your scope changes. When you're first starting out, maybe your first goal, your scope is your desk, your problem, not what you're dealing with. And as you progress through the seniority, your scope maybe expands from your desk to your desk and a couple of people near you. And again, if you're working remotely and virtually, the people that you work most closely with in your team. And then as you progress a bit more, your scope becomes all of your team. And then as you progress, it's your team and the adjacent teams. And you go beyond there, you start thinking of your team, the adjacent teams, the sales and marketing teams, or the customer service teams, and you start thinking bigger and bigger scope until you get ultimately to, wherever you get to, either as a manager or as an individual contributor, your scope is starting to be the whole industry. And how do we have an impact on that? What's happening in that? So that's the way I think of it always, is it's how much scope you include. And the bigger your scope, the more senior you are in that respect.
And you just mentioned this kind of fork situation in the career of an engineer, that he might go as a manager or become a more hardcore tech person, contributor. And can you define those terms, like for me and for others as well? Like, what is that so special about that decision which engineers should make? Maybe it's not even a decision. I don't know how that happens.
Yeah, I think that we have to be careful with fork and decision, because it's not a one-way thing. It's not a fork that you take it and you're stuck going one way or the other. You can, and I have done, for example, transition back and forth. I've gone between being an individual contributor at various levels of seniority to being a manager at various levels of seniority. It really depends where you want your career to go, and even then, say that can change depending on circumstances. So, working as I have in the last few years as a contractor in the UK, most contract roles are for individual contributors. So I've ended up back in that side of things. Before that, I was an executive in a startup, working as a VP engineering, and I'd ended up in the management role. I've gone back and forth between the two throughout my career, because when I started my own business, by default, I was the CEO.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
sure.
It was only me to start with, and then as we grew, it was more people. But I started the company; it was my money, so by default, I was the boss. I had to learn to manage people. I had to learn how to sell and how to market and do all that management side. So I've then taken that in some other roles, and when the opportunity or need has arisen, I've stepped up and progressed through to, let's say, VP engineering level and a global head of development. At other times, I've taken steps back from that and gone, I don't really want to do that. I've been programming since I was 7 or 8. I quite enjoy solving the technology. I want to do some hands-on stuff. And in some organizations, as a manager, you face an awful lot of politics. You spend more time in meetings than you'd like to. So, like I say, through various reasons, I've gone back and forth. So it's not a decision you have to make and stick with for the rest of your life. You can change it. There are some downsides of that, and it does get a little bit harder as you get more senior to be able to switch between roles, because if you've been a very senior individual contributor and you haven't managed for a while, it can make it quite difficult to find a management role. If you've been in a management role for a while, you're, like my C++, it's potentially got a bit rusty. It's a bit harder to switch back to the IC role without maybe taking a few steps backwards, unless maybe you've got some specialist domain knowledge. But you can move back and forth, particularly if you're moving, say, if you want to go from a permanent manager to a contractor in an IC role, that's maybe a little bit easier. So it's a choice that you can make. You don't have to make permanently. I think you should probably try it both. The company that made me redundant last year, one of the things I did really like there is that they gave people the opportunity. A lot of individual contributors, when they got to that level where the load forked, they gave people the opportunity to try it out for 6 months. And that was a really great thing, I think. And I saw several people there try it out and decide it wasn't for them. It's like they wanted to stay more technical. They didn't enjoy managing people. They didn't enjoy the work that comes with that. For me personally, I've enjoyed both sides. I've found it very, very satisfying, particularly to work with junior developers. So, as you pointed out, I'm quite old now.
No,
I've
of
worked
course
with a
not.
number
Of
of
course
junior
not.
developers who, 15 years ago, they were a 20-year-old in their first job. They're now staff or senior engineers and above that. So I've kept in touch with a lot of them. I've still provided them advice and help. So it's been incredibly satisfying to see that somebody that I met straight out of uni as a junior developer is now a staff or principal level developer, have really progressed their career, and they're still coming to me for advice. So that's really satisfying. but I've seen how they've grown, and I've been part of that growth. And some of them I've worked with at 2 or 3 different companies now. So I've enjoyed that aspect of it.
Amazing. And I would say that was it for today. And I want to give a special thank you for everything you do for the community, for like you mentioned, like this impact you had on these junior engineers and giving advice to them. And now you basically do it at a way more larger scale. You are kind of giving advice, tips, and kind of mentor all people around you in your social networks. And thanks for that. Thanks for this outstanding conversation we had now. It was amazing. I just super enjoyed it, and I'm super excited about it. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for having me on. And like I say, it's a pleasure. I learn as much from doing this as other people learn from it. So it's a win-win for everyone as far as I'm concerned.